Ladies and gentlemen, we'll get started with our next panel. And I must admit, I'm probably looking forward to this. Of all the events we've had and the great discussions we've had this week, when I saw this scheduled for today, this was the one I was really looking forward to because I don't know if those of you who are younger probably don't realize this, but about 20 years ago, at the advent of free agency in the National Football League, and with the Green Bay Packers franchise kind of being in the middle of the pack or below for some 25 years, there was strong feeling across the National Football League by very learned people in the league that Green Bay would never win again, could never win again. 20 years later, obviously, we've seen that they've been able to win quite a bit here. Cliff Crystal, as I mentioned before, is an award-winning Hall of Fame caliber writer, nationally acclaimed beat writer for the Green Bay Packers, a columnist. He's worked for the Press-Gazette and the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. He's one of 44 members of the Pro Football Hall of Fame Selection Committee, and that is an august panel of people. He also serves on the Packers Hall of Fame Selection Committee and in the Halls of Fame for both the Wisconsin Basketball and Football Coaches Associations. He's written books on bicycling in Wisconsin, the Packers-Bears rivalry, Lambeau Field, the Pro Football Draft, and on Packers training camp at St. Norbert College during the Lombardi years. Bob Harlan is enjoying his second career with the Packers, chairman emeritus, having retired in January 28, 2008, after 37 years with the organization in a variety of capacities that prepared him well to lead the franchise in a crucial time 20 years ago. Off the field, the crowning achievement of his tenure was the $295 million redevelopment of Lambeau Field, part of which we're sitting in right here now. Central to assuring the team's financial survival, obviously for the future in the National Football League, that project was just absolutely the one thing beyond the Reggie White, Brett Favre era. Beyond that, what makes the Packers viable today is that project. On the field, his Packers posted a record of 152-88 between 1993 and 2007, and he returned the Lombardi Trophy to Green Bay with a victory in Super Bowl 31. Ron Wolf began his career in 1963 with the Oakland Raiders, where his personnel contributions helped lead the Raiders to Super Bowl 11 championship in 1976. He joined the Packers in 1991 and declaring upon his arrival, "I was brought here to win," unquote. And he immediately began fulfilling that mission by first hiring Mike Holmgren as head coach, then trading for an unproven quarterback whose name most of us couldn't even pronounce, Brett Favre. During his tenure, oh, and by the way, a little something, he convinced God to convince Reggie White to come to Green Bay, and that changed everything. During his tenure, the Packers had a winning percentage of 64%, 9 winning seasons, 7 playoff appearances in 10 years, highlighted by that Super Bowl 31 victory. Please welcome our panelists back to Lambeau Field, Cliff Crystal, Bob Harlan, and Ron Wolf.
Thank you, Wayne. I don't want to bore you with a lot of stats. Wayne touched on this a little, but I think I'll just take a few minutes to kind of give you some background on what this place was like late 1980s, early 1990s. In 1967, Vince Lombardi, in his final season as coach, led the Packers to their 3rd straight NFL championship. It's only the 2nd time that had been done in the history of the league, going back to 1920. The first time was the Packers from 1929 to 31, when the final standings determined the league champion. The 1967 season was the 49th in the history of the NFL, and at that point, Green Bay, despite being the smallest city in the league from day one, when it entered the league in 1921, had won 11 championships. The Bears had won 8, no other team had won more than 4. The Packers had won the first 2 Super Bowls under Lombardi and 5 NFL championships in 9 years. And it is still considered one of the greatest dynasties in the history of sports, and that period is one of the most compelling stories in the history of sports. Then came a 24-year drought. From 1968 through 1991, the Packers finished with a winning record only 5 times and made the playoffs twice. Their winning percentage of .422 was the 4th worst in the NFL. They were a consistently bad football team. The Packers went through 5 head coaches during that period, and each one finished with a worse record than his predecessor. The Packers were still selling out Lambeau Field on a season ticket basis, as they had done since 1960, but their fan base was disgruntled and becoming disinterested. In 1986, for example, the Packers averaged 5,000 no-shows for their home games, including more than 10,000 for a game against the rival Minnesota Vikings on an unseasonably warm 32-degree December day. Moreover, the team's off-the-field problems had culminated in simultaneous sexual assault trials at the Brown County Courthouse here in Green Bay against 2 players, James Lofton and Mossy Cade. Those trials were in May 1987. At that point, Frank DeFord of Sports Illustrated, maybe the most respected journalist in the country during that time, wrote, "Actually, the answer to Green Bay's dilemma is simple. It should sell the franchise to Milwaukee. Since Curly Lambeau, the team's founder, stepped down as Packer coach in 1949, only Lombardi has been able to forge a winning record for a career. Maybe the demographic deck is just too stacked against Green Bay. The scandals and defeats that have brought a sense of gloom and doom to the grand old franchise may seem even worse, simply because deep inside, the good people of Green Bay fear that this may be the way it's going to be from now on." I had covered that team for most of that 24-year period. Frank DeFord was not overstating the matter. There was widespread belief in pro football circles and to a degree in this community that the Packers could never win again. Then suddenly the revival occurred. It started partly when Bob Harlan took over as president in 1989, and certainly his key decision, and the one that really turned the franchise around, was when he fired Tom Bratz late in the 1991 season and hired Ron Wolf as general manager. Wayne's covered what they've accomplished, but I think this entire Packer phenomenon that continues today just continues to grow their legacies. Start out, I'll just ask some questions and let the two of them respond. Bob, from my perspective, that 24-year famine was largely the result of organizational inertia and just conservative management at all levels of the operation. What prompted you in November 1991 to make that bold decision to fire a general manager, which was totally uncharacteristic of this team and very unusual in the NFL?
Well, Cliff, a lot of it is what has already been stated. I joined the Packers in June of 1971, and I went through that 20-year drought where we had 4 winning seasons and 2 playoff appearances. And as you said, every coach we hired had a worse winning percentage than his predecessor. We were a stairway going down, getting worse every year. And I heard from the fans, and I listened to their complaints, and they were losing faith in us. I'd have fans who would call me and say, "Bob, Packers don't care if they're 4-12 or 12-4. All they want to do is make money." Or they would call and say, "You know, we can't keep up with the rest of the league. The league has passed us by. The Lombardi era is the last great era we're ever going to have." And another complaint was that we never know who's making football decisions out there. Is it the board of directors? Is it the executive committee? We never know who's in charge. So when we took over as president in '89, we made our #1 priority to find a way to win and find a way to get the Packers back up among the elite teams in the National Football League. And I felt the very best way to do that was go out and find a very strong football person, give him total, full authority over the operation with no interference, and then simply get out of his way and let him do his job. And as you look at the Packers from the outside with a 45-person board of directors, you can see where there can be a lot of interference, and there had been in previous years. And I wanted to eliminate that. And I told the board, we're going to let this gentleman come in, do his job. We're not going to interfere with him one bit. And we kept that promise for all the time he was here. Ron came in, and in 2 days, he changed the face of the franchise. The first day he was here, he told me he wanted to make a trade for an Atlanta backup quarterback named Brett Favre. The second day he was here, he went down on the practice field, came back into my office afterwards, and he says, "Bob, you got a problem down there. It's a country club atmosphere. These guys are 4-10. They're walking around like they're 10-4. We're going to change things. I knew Lindy Infante was in trouble. But once Ron walked through the door, though those calls from the fans stopped, it was obvious, first of all, that there was a gentleman in charge of football, and secondly, that we did want to win. Lindy Infante go with 3 years remaining on his contract, gave us the next 3 years paying 2 head coaches. But his decisions were outstanding. We started winning immediately after that 20-year drought. 5 years later, we win Super Bowl 31, bringing the Vince Lombardi Trophy back here. And then I want to give credit to the gentleman who followed him, because once we hired Ted Thompson, we gave Ted the very same authority that we had given Ron, and he built his organization the very same way. He hired Mike McCarthy as coach. He drafted a franchise quarterback in Aaron Rodgers, signed a talented free agent in Charles Woodson. We kept right on winning. They won Super Bowl 45, and what makes me most proud is that after that 20-year drought, when everybody said we can't win, free agency is going to kill the Green Bay Packers, with Ron Wolf and Ted Thompson in charge the last 20 years, we've had 16 winning seasons, 14 playoff appearances, and been to 3 Super Bowls, winning 2 of them. These 2 gentlemen, Ron Wolf, Ted Thompson, they not only resurrected the franchise, they kept it alive, and that's something this franchise has never been able to do in the past.
I'd like to add something to that if I could, Cliff. When I came here, the Packers had the poorest record in the entire National Football League. And when I left, 9.5 years later, we had the best record in the National Football League. But what is amazing is the job that Ted Thompson has done here in that whole period, from the time I came here through Ted Thompson. The Packers have the best one-loss record in the National Football Conference. That's an incredible statistic. Just amazing. And there you go.
Cliff, if I could add one quick note. We did something different when we hired Ron. Normally, you wait till the end of the season and bring in a general manager and let him look at the team on tape and decide what he wants to do. I wanted to try something different, and fortunately, we had a great relationship with the New York Jets. Ron was scouting for the Jets at that time. And I called them and asked for permission to hire him at that point late in the season, because I wanted him to come in and not look at the team on tape. I wanted him to come in and live with this team. I wanted him to be at practice, in the locker room, on the airplanes, in the hotel, watch the coaches prepare for a game, and then come and tell me what was wrong with this team rather than trying to look at it on tape. Fortunately, the Jets gave me that permission. We hired Ron in November, and like I said earlier, his decisions early on changed the face of this franchise immediately. And I'm forever thankful that we did it in November and didn't wait till January.
Did you realize how bad things were here? Or did you just go to work to fix it?
No, I did not realize. I had Lee Rummel to thank for all that. Lee Rummel, as maybe most of you know, is a walking history book of Green Bay Packers football. And he was a public relations director here. And he would inform me of things going on within the framework of the Packers. And he had, he could talk to you about Curly Lambeau and Vince Lombardi. And really and truly, I'm really rattling on here, but I don't mean to do that. Really and truly, he gave me a videotape of something called I think it's the Grandstand Franchise. I think it was put out in 1984. You guys familiar with that? Grandstand Franchise, put out by Wisconsin Public Television, which gave me the background of the whole Green Bay Packers thing, which was very helpful to me. And then I played on the tradition of the Packers, which is a marvelous tradition. Just what you said, 11 championships. It's incredible.
When I was covering the team during especially the Star and Greg years when they brought back Hall of Fame players, one of the biggest criticisms around here was they're living in the past. And I remember one of the first things you asked me shortly after you got here was, what did I think of having an honorary captain from those Lombardi eras? And I thought, oh boy, we got another guy who's going to be living in the past. Why do you think, Bob, why do you think he was able to pull that off when people who had been part of that couldn't? bringing back and renewing the tradition and making it feel like this was someplace special?
Well, I think Ron really, he's got the same appreciation for the history that I have. I've told people forever that this is the greatest story in sports and it'll never happen again. I mean, it's really almost more like fiction than reality that we exist in this little town. And I think you've got to cherish what has been accomplished before. And what Curly Lambeau did to start this team and preserve it, and the way the citizens kept stepping forward with stock drives to save it and keep it alive every time it was bankrupt and about to close down. And then for Vince Lombardi to come in 1959 and resurrect what he had to do in 1959, what Ron Wolf had to do in 1991. The Packers were miserable during the 50s, and Vince Lombardi came in, took charge. And I asked Ron Wolf to do the same thing in 91, and he did it. One of the interesting things about Ron is he was interviewed in Green Bay in 1987. Judge Robert Perrins was our president at that time, and he was looking to bring in somebody to be in the football department, really not as a general manager, but somebody just to strengthen the staff. And one of my responsibilities at that time was to go out to the airport and bring in the candidates and let them meet with Judge Perrins, and then I'd take him back out to the airport. And Ron got in late on a Sunday night, about 11 o'clock, 11:30. As soon as he gets off the plane, he says, "Bob, I haven't had any dinner. Could we go someplace and eat?" So I took him to the finest restaurant in town. I took him to a Denny's down here on Oneida. And I tried to wow him with what we could accomplish. But to sit and talk with him about football, I knew about him and his years with the Raiders and what he had accomplished, but to have that personal touch, to sit there for 2.5 hours talking football, where he talked to me about our board and our executive committee and our facilities and our history and everything. And at the same time, I got a chance to talk to him about scouting and setting up a staff and how much he liked to go out and scout personally and everything. That was very beneficial to me, never thinking that I would have a choice where I could go and select this gentleman. But I got to know him so well that night, and he had his interview the next day and withdrew immediately. And I had a feeling that unless he had full authority, unless he knew that it was his team to run and nobody would be coming at him from behind, I don't think he was going to take the job. And so I tried to be, when I did approach him in 91, I tried to be as well prepared as I could. And I called him on the telephone. He was scouting for the Jets, and I gave him his salaries and the length of the years and his responsibilities. And the number one responsibility was the authority to hire and fire the head coach. And I just felt if he didn't have that, we were never going to get him to come to Green Bay and help this franchise. And we talked on a Friday afternoon, and fortunately on Saturday morning he says, I think we're pretty close to a deal. And so I laugh about Denny's, but it really gave me the opportunity to get to know him so well, his philosophies, his appreciation for the tradition. And then he came in and believed in that. I can still remember him telling me when he walked Reggie White out on the field. He said, if you don't get goosebumps walking out onto this field and looking up at the circle of the names and the history of this franchise, you shouldn't be a Green Bay Packer. And Ron and I hit it off immediately, and like I say, he answered our prayers.
Would that have been a deal breaker? If you wouldn't have been given full authority, would you have said no?
I don't know. At that time, people my age were not being hired as we were considered too old. I believe I was 50. 53, okay. I was going to say 52, but dang it. Anyway, and people that age never got, you didn't get hired anymore. You were considered too old. So it might not have been.
But
It helped, though.
But you had an experience in Tampa where you were kind of undercut by a head coach because things weren't spelled out, right? Didn't you feel like you needed that to succeed?
I needed that to succeed, yeah. I did. No, I really did. I mean, it's got to be your ship. You have to do it. And, to get back to your question, I want to talk a little bit about this honorary captaincy program. There are some of you in this audience who will find this very difficult to believe. But when I got here, I would venture to say that 75% of our football team had no idea who Vince Lombardi was. Now, let me just tell you something. Every day they would drive down what street to come here to go to work. I mean, every day. They had no idea who this guy was. And that's what part of bringing the tradition back or making it more prominent among our own football players, so they can understand that, yeah, you can be successful here in Green Bay. Look at these guys. Look at those names up there in Lambeau Field. And that played a big part of it, but it was incredible to me, the lack of knowledge. Baseball has something that football doesn't have, and I'm hoping football can eventually get, and that's a history or respect for the history of the game and the players that played the game. Here in Green Bay, you have that, the respect for the players who played the game.
The culture here changed almost overnight. What did Ron do to change the culture? I mean, that's essential to winning, I would assume.
Well, he was coming in a situation, Cliff, that, as you well know, that previously our executive committee was appointing the head coach many times. It was a decision of the board of directors who the head coach would be. And in most cases, we had one person who was both the head coach and the general manager, and then in Lindy and Fonte's later years, we had a split when Tom Bratz came in, that he had 50% of the authority and the head coach had 50%. And it's simply, the message I heard from the fans, I understood, and I told them that there was a debate about who was in charge and why aren't football people making football decisions. And that was simply the thought I had, you know, find the best people and let them do their jobs, no matter what department. I felt, and I still feel to this day, the most important hire the president of the Green Bay Packers makes is the general manager. Because you're taking the most important thing you've got, your football operation, and putting it in the hands of one man. And it's got to be the right decision. And I remember a couple of days after I appointed Ron, the Milwaukee Sentinel ran a big headline the next day saying, Harlan puts his neck on the line. And because I had fired Tom Bratz and done it in the middle of the season like this, and that reporter saw me at our game. We were in Minnesota that weekend, and he saw me at breakfast on Sunday morning. He says, I imagine you're upset with me and what I wrote Friday. And I said, no, I'm not upset, but the way I looked at it, as president of this corporation, my neck was on the line if I didn't take some action. If I was satisfied with the mediocrity and the poor football that we had had for 24 years, why should I be the president and why should I be in charge here? And so I wanted to get the right person and show dramatically that, yes, right now one person is making football decisions. We're going to live and die with this gentleman. And fortunately, Ron turned out to be that person.
Did you do things specifically to change the culture?
Well, I thought it's something that is, yes, I did. I did a couple of things to try to change the culture. Number one was, I've already touched on it, to let our present players know, we're talking about the 1992 players now, that there is something about putting on this uniform and about running out on Lambeau Field. This isn't just another place, another stadium in another city. This is Lambeau Field. This is Green Bay, Wisconsin. More championships here, more members in the Hall of Fame. That wasn't necessarily true. I think the Bears have more, but we tried. You know, that's another gripe of mine. It seems to me they were putting a lot of Pittsburgh Steelers in the Hall of Fame these days. Now, I worked 25 years with the Raiders, and on December 23rd, 1972, we played a game in Pittsburgh that changed everything. We put all those Pittsburgh guys in that Hall of Fame. So anyway, where was it? Yes, I did. I worked hard at that, and I think the key was the first year we brought back people who had played for the Packers, I'm talking about 1992, who actually had adopted Wisconsin as their home. And then we started with the people up there, the Paul Hornings, the Willie Davises, the Herb Adderleys, the Bart Starrs, and so on and so forth.
Cliff, one of the things I enjoyed about Ron is even after we were winning, once he had gotten here in '92, in the mid-'90s when we were winning and closing in on the Super Bowl, on Tuesdays, that's the players' days off, and they would come into the locker room and play checkers and sit and talk and laugh and carry on all day with nothing to do. And Ron always made it a point to bring in some free agents on Tuesdays. And not only would he bring them in for the tryouts on that particular day, but he made sure that he walked them through the locker room so all the players could see who was in town, and everybody sat there guessing, geez, I wonder if that guy's after my job. He kept everybody at a peak. And Mike Holmgren was such a perfect choice. I asked Mike one time, he had so many offers, he could have gone to so many different places at the time we hired him. I said, why did you select Green Bay? And he said, because Ron Wolf is here and I know he'll find players for me. But Ron kept everybody at a pitch where you got to keep winning. And we had an edge all at once. We never had that edge before. And it changed that locker room totally. And he deserves credit for that.
You know, I've been doing a lot of research on the Lombardi years, and I always thought, well, one of the things, Lombardi was in a 12-team league, a 14-team league, a 16-team league. It was easier to win championships. But the more I study and read about the guy, the more I'm convinced that he won that much because he was absolutely ruthless. I mean, he treated veterans no differently than rookies. He made them insecure constantly. I mean, guys would be all pros, and he'd bench them or bring them, put somebody in their starting spot at the start of a training camp. How important is that to keep people on their toes, especially players, that, hey, if you don't produce, you might be gone tomorrow?
Well, I think that's very important, but as you said, it was a different time. I mean, those guys had nowhere else to go. They could go to Canada if they wanted. In fact, that's what brought about the American Football League. You know, there were, when I started in the game, there were 666 players in the whole game, 20 teams. Now you times that times 3, that's how many players are right now on these teams here. So that didn't sound too good, did it?
But
Take that, 666 times.
Could I give you one
Multiply, thank you, that's coming.
one quick toughness story? When Ray Rhodes was here, Ron hired Ray Rhodes, and during the year things were not going very well, and Ron goes on the road and scouts all during the college football season. And he would come back into town on Friday night, and I would sit with him on Sunday at the games, and he kept saying, no, I'm going to keep Ray, I'm going to keep Ray, I'm going to keep Ray. And finally, late in the year, college football season is completed, and Ron comes back into town, and he's got a chance to go to some practices. And he comes into me late in the season, and he says, I'm going to make a coaching change. I said, what made you change your mind? And he said, we've lost our toughness. Coach doesn't have the team anymore. We got to get that toughness back. And it showed the, you know, it showed the attitude that he had. And Ray, I think, had a couple years left on his contract, but that didn't matter. He was ready to make a change. When he made a mistake, he admitted it. He was ready to make a change, and he did it with Ray Rhodes. And it did change the team again. But the toughness showed at that point. We'd lost it. He wanted it back, and he made a move to get it.
in 1980, Packers considered drafting Ronnie Lott, who's in the Hall of Fame. He told them he didn't want to play in Green Bay. Or that was 81. 1980, Packers had drafted Bruce Clark. I might have my years wrong there. Number 4, he refused to play here and signed in Toronto. A lot of players felt the same way. I mean, now the vibe you get is everybody loves to play in Green Bay. What changed all that?
I think what changed it, and you know, a lot of the credit has to go to Bob Harlan, is what we try to do is make this a place where all you had to do was play football. You had to be a professional football player, though. You had to be a professional. We wanted you to come do your job. You get there at 7:30 in the morning. You could go home at 4:30 in the afternoon. But while you're here, your job is to be a Green Bay Packer, a member of the Green Bay Packers, to represent the Green Bay Packers, and be a professional football player. That's all we want you to do. We don't want you to do anything else. We don't need a bunch of limousines sitting out here taking it to this social event or that social event in Milwaukee or social event in, hate to use this term, Minneapolis, but, and, you know, the guys bought into that, and we were able to sell that. You come here, that's all they ask you to do. They ask you to be a football player.
Cliff, when bringing in Reggie White was a huge move, too. Not only were we winning, but I think to have Reggie White select Green Bay sent the message to a lot of people in the National Football League that this is a great place to play and give it a try. I talked to Reggie a couple of years after he had come here, and he told me that when he was making this tour of NFL cities when he was a free agent, that he was in Detroit visiting the Lions. And he said, I said to my agent, you know, Green Bay just keeps calling and calling and calling. And I think out of courtesy, we ought to pay them a visit. So they had their private plane and they flew to Green Bay, and Ron Wolf and Mike Holmgren took Reggie out for dinner, and Reggie told me, he says, when I was getting on the plane afterwards, I turned to my agent and says, don't be surprised if this is where I wind up. And I think they, as they said all along, they talked football to a football player. Everybody else was hiring bands and blowing up balloons and having parades trying to woo Reggie. We had two great football people who sat and talked football, and that appealed to him. And there again, it was a huge factor in changing the attitude in the National Football League about, do I want to play in Green Bay?
You know, everybody wanted Reggie White. I don't know if anybody else wanted Brett Favre. And he had been a number 2, and he had already in 1 year worn out his welcome in Atlanta. From the sounds of it, all he did was drink beer and try to throw the football out of the stadium. What made you so confident that that was the right move? And do you feel like when you step into a situation like you stepped into, that you have to make bold decisions?
Well, I don't know about making bold decisions, but I know one thing about in order to win in the National Football League, you got to have a quarterback. You can have a lot of things. You don't have a quarterback, imagine going to work every day knowing you don't have a chance. Me coming in here, if you're a defensive coordinator, you ride in here, you pitch a shutout, that's still may not be good enough because they might intercept the ball and run it in for a touchdown. So, having had an opportunity to study Brett Favre in 1991 when I was with the Jets, I was convinced he was the best player in the draft, in the 1991 draft. And he wore out his welcome in Atlanta, and we started our dancing. I knew where they were going to end up, and I was confident. Whenever he took the field, I had a feeling that the field tilted in his team's favor, and that was the way it was here in Green Bay.
Father DePole, Norbert and a good friend of the Lombardi family, told me that when Lombardi was hired, you know, the word got out right away that Marie, his wife, wasn't too excited about coming to Green Bay. And so he asked her shortly after they arrived, do you think that you'll come to like it here? And her answer was, it all depends on one little 3-letter word, win. Is that what it's all about? I mean,
I think it's enormous. I think every athlete loves to be a part of a winning tradition, and Green Bay had lost that. I mean, I can remember when we were considering drafting John Jefferson. I had dealt with his agent many times in the past, and he called me and he says, don't take my man, don't take him, he's not coming there. And it just so happened that we weren't in a position to take him anyway. But interestingly enough, a few years later, John Jefferson did come to Green Bay and play. And he loved it when he was here. I think people have to come here and feel the tradition, feel the atmosphere at Lambeau Field, and know what this franchise stands for. I always got a kick when I came to the stadium early on Sunday mornings. The visiting team would come out maybe 2 hours before kickoff just to loosen up, and still had on T-shirts and stuff, weren't in their pads or anything. And the number of times I would see players pointing at the names in the circle that we've got with the Hall of Famers listed. And the history was there. All we needed to do, Cliff, is to start winning and prove that that history could be recaptured. And a lot of people felt it couldn't, quite honestly. I can still remember when we went into free agency in the salary cap, newspapers and broadcasters around the country kept saying the same thing. First franchise that's going to suffer is going to be Green Bay. It's too cold, it's too small, they never win, nobody will want to go there. Ron Wolf changed that. He showed people that Reggie White wanted to come here. The winning was huge. Once we started winning, the tradition was built again. The tradition was existing again, and that made Green Bay an attractive place.
How important was it to pick the right coach? You hired Mike Holmgren. He turned out to be an outstanding coach.
Yes, he was a remarkable coach.
How key is that decision, or how important?
It's enormous. I mean, because what he brought with him is that winning. The 49ers were the little darlings of football about that time, and he was the offensive coordinator with the San Francisco 49ers. He went 10-4 with a guy named Mike Morosky. So I figured if he can do that, he could probably come here and at least go 8-8 with what we had. But, he did. I mean, the job that those guys did those first couple of years with the collection of players that they had is just remarkable. I mean, to go 9-7, and it was literally a little bit like a Trailways bus station, because there were 3 coming in, 3 going out, 4 coming in, 4 going out, and those guys kept coaching and coaching and coaching, and we turned this thing around and went 9-7 in 1992. Just a remarkable job. It also helps that at that same time, a decision was made at that quarterback position, and a number 4 trotted out on the field, and suddenly there was magic there, and that helped too.
How important is that when you rebuild to complement things? I mean, the first few days, I remember in the practice field, Favre was throwing around passes, and I thought, oh boy, this guy could be another Bobby Douglas, where you had to watch every minute you were standing on the sidelines because one of his passes might hit you in the head. But he had a rifle arm.
That's right. You had to be alert.
And and Favre was a little scatter-armed at the start. How important was that then to have a guy that you hired as a head coach who had tutored quarterbacks? You know, I remember there was a time here the Packers had James Lofton, one of the greatest receivers of the last 25, 30 years, but they couldn't get him the football either because they couldn't protect or they didn't have a quarterback. So how important is putting all those pieces together?
I think that's to touch on your original question about Mike Holmgren, that's one of his real strengths. He realized that by taking Steve Mariucci and just assigning him to Brett Favre, that would be a perfect buffer between Mike Holmgren and Brett Favre. So Mike would talk to Mariucci and say, tell that not to throw the ball so hard, you know. And of course Favre would hear that. But that was how Bill Walsh was. Bill Walsh, who was the coach of San Francisco, would never condemn a player in practice. He would condemn the coach. He would tell the coach, can't you coach such and such any better than that? Can't you tell him we need him to do this? And that's exactly what Mike Holmgren did with Brett Favre.
Was it what they always said, a good cop, bad cop kind of thing with Mariucci?
Oh, I don't know if it was that, but I mean, you look at the career that both of them have had. I'm talking about Holmgren and Favre. It's been outstanding.